Hello, welcome to my living room for another video. My name's Raj K, and in this video I'm going to be taking you through the EOS R6. The R6 was launched alongside the R5 by Canon sometime last year, and I feel like the R5 kind of stole the show. The R6 has a lot going for it at a very reasonable price point. So in this video I'm going to show you what I use it for and why I like it. This video is kind of about what I would take out on a day-to-day basis. So when I take for a walk or when I go traveling, not that we can do a lot of traveling right now, but you know, something that I would take with me when I go for my daily mandated exercise session. And I want a camera that's quite versatile, so if there's a nice sunset and I can do a nice landscape image, I want to be able to do that. But also I want to be able to do some wildlife if I take a longer lens. There's some beautiful bird life around here, and I also want the option to be able to do some portraiture. Now normally I want to take a one lens and one camera kind of setup. So for this I'm going to be taking the EOS R6 with the 24-70 RF 2.8 lens. The 24-70 is very versatile. You know, I can get that wide angle for landscapes and architecture. I can zoom in and do portraits, and I can also do some nice close-up work. So I'm going to show you how I go about that when we're out and about. Sometimes if I'm going to a specific place, I might take a longer lens with me too to photograph some of the bird life. But I've already done a video on that. So for this video, I'm just going to be taking a 24-70 and the camera. What I want to take with me most of the time is as little weight as possible, while still retaining, you know, optimum image quality. And this combination is perfect. And as I'm a portrait photographer, for the most part, this is the kind of photography I do just for fun, to relax. And so I don't really have an aim or a goal of anything specific to photograph. I just know that this is a beautiful location I'm going to, and hopefully we'll come out with some lovely images. So let's head on out. We've come out for a walk at a local park near us. We come here quite regularly, and when I go for walks I like to keep a camera with me, and the R6 just suits that really nicely. I don't really need super high resolution images because I don't really need to take up that much room on my computer for just images I'm taking while I'm walking around. And I've got the 24-70 RF 2.8 L lens on the camera, and it's a really versatile lens. Allows me to get lovely landscape images, some close-up images, even portraiture if we're doing some stuff like that, and it's great for video and stuff. What's also lovely is it has image stabilization built into the lens. So this is the first 24-70 2.8 lens from Canon that actually has image stabilization built in. Alongside with the image stabilization built into the R6, makes for some really, really useful and quite clever capability. You get up to 8 stops of image stabilization with this. 8 stops is absolutely crazy. And so through this video, I'm going to try and show you a few little bits of using that image stabilization to your advantage. One of the reasons I really love this image stabilization system is it often means I don't have to carry a tripod. I've kind of got in the water here, I'm wearing wellies, it's still a bit cold, and I'm actually shooting at f/22. I've set the ISO to 50 ISO, you can set it to a lower than 100 ISO on this camera, and I'm shooting at 1/6 of a second. And it's quite a dull day anyway, so it's quite cloudy, so there's not a lot of light, so it allows me to get that long shutter speed. But I can shoot at 1/6 of a second, handheld, even one hand, and still get a very sharp image. And that way I'm able to get these reeds at the bottom and some silky water, you know, smooth out the water on the waterfall over there, all in one image, all handheld, and no need for extra kit. It's just fantastic. The R6 is effectively a 1DX Mark III in a smaller body. It's a mirrorless version of the 1DX Mark III. You get the same sensor and a lot of the same technologies as you did in the 1DX. And you might be able to see it's raining, and it's going to start raining quite heavily in a minute. And I'm not worried at all because the R6, like the R5, is very well weather sealed, and I've never had to worry about getting them a little bit wet. And they're better weather sealed than the EOS R was, and the EOS R I had, you know, completely soaking wet in the rain in Wales doing some stuff out there, and I never had to worry about it. It's just, I mean, you can see it there, it's all pretty wet now. I particularly like using this camera as my day-to-day kind of do everything type of camera because it's incredibly versatile. It's not super high resolution, I don't need that massive file format for most images that'll only ever end up on Instagram or on the internet. And 20 megapixels is more than enough to print up to A3 or even larger. So, you know, it gives me plenty of performance, gives me the flexibility to shoot a bit of wildlife if I want to photograph the birds while I'm out here. Sometimes I'll bring a longer lens as well. And the other great thing about shooting with the R6 is, I don't know where I was going with that. Because a lot of the images I would shoot on this on a day-to-day type thing, I'm not going to really want to put on my computer and do a heavy edit on. I'd often just send it over to my phone and do a small edit on something like Lightroom Mobile or Snapseed. So I can have an always-on Bluetooth connection with this. Even if it's in my bag, I can pull out my phone, hit the Canon Connect app, and it'll pair up with the camera, turn it on and turn on the Wi-Fi so that I can pull off images from the memory card in my bag while I'm out and about. So I can stop, have a cup of tea, get my phone out, pull an image off, do a quick edit, stick it on Instagram if I wanted to. It's such a fluid and easy to work with system. It just makes life so much easier if you're a sort of blogger or vlogger. Oh, that's nice. Yeah. The other really cool part of this camera is the autofocus. This camera is equipped with Canon's dual pixel AF. This is dual pixel AF 2, so it's the second iteration of dual pixel autofocus. And it allows the camera to track faces and track subjects much more accurately and across basically 100% of the frame. But the really cool thing is it can track the eye of animals as well as people. So you can do birds, cats and dogs and animals that look like that. So I've got this set to servo and on face tracking, and it's just picking out the swan's head and eyes, and it just tracks that across the frame, and it's so easy to shoot like this. It was a little bit too windy to record me talking to camera about this, so I've just recorded the clips, but one of the amazing features on this camera is the slow-mo footage that you're able to capture. The R6 can do 120 frames per second full HD slow-mo footage, so you can capture some really amazing, beautiful looking slow motion imagery. It's just so easy to do so, and the camera will fully autofocus and track during the slow-mo footage. The other thing that this camera has built in is image stabilization, which I've already talked about. But one of the things that you can use it for is in video. And often, if we're going out to shoot one of these kind of videos, we'll take out the EOS R, and we'll have to take a gimbal as well so that we can do those sort of walking and talking shots. Since the R5 and the R6 have been out and we've had those, we've been able to film on one of those without the gimbal and just hand hold it. And even to an extent, while we're walking, we can hand hold the camera well enough to still do smooth and non-shaky shots. So I've done a little comparison here with me just following Jade as she walks up the path. It's a really rocky path, so I'm not particularly steady on my feet. And one has the image stabilization off. And the other has the image stabilization on. I'm not using the digital image stabilization at all. So the only image stabilization I'm using is the optical, so in the lens and in the camera body. You do have the option to take this a little bit further and use digital image stabilization on top of this. So what this does is crop into the image slightly on the sensor and then sort of use that to give the camera some leeway to move the image around the sensor. And this gives you a little bit more image stabilization. But to be honest, I don't find that I need to use that. I find with the in-body image stabilization, it's more than enough for me to get the kind of shots that I would want. While we were walking back towards the car, we came across this area with some dead plants that looked a little bit, red and yellow, and they really suited the color palette that Jade happened to be wearing at the time. And I hadn't gone out with the intention of shooting Jade at all for this video, for once. But by chance, the colors matched and it looked absolutely amazing, so we had to do a little bit of portraiture. And this is why I love walking around with a camera that has the versatility of being used for both landscape, wildlife and portraiture. So I shot these at about 70mm. I nearly always shoot portraiture at 50mm or longer, and in this shot I particularly wanted to try and keep the colours pretty consistent across the entirety of the image, so I didn't want to get any of the background in, or too much of the background in where there was too many greens and things like that. So I just wanted to keep it sort of deep reds and yellows and browns, these lovely tones. For most of these, I'm shooting at 160 ISO, 200th of a second exposure time, and my aperture is f2.8, so I'm shooting wide open. I want to get quite a shallow depth of field so that the sort of foreground grasses are nice and blurry and the background isn't too distracting. For outdoor portraiture like this, I like to create as much depth as possible within the image. So I try and look for leading lines or use some of the foreground to my advantage. So what I've done is I've got quite low and I've put some of these grasses and reeds or whatever they are in between myself and Jade, and then there's lots of sort of foreground interest as well as from Jade to the background there's lots of stuff in between her and there. So there's lots of stuff that's kind of gradually coming into focus and then gradually going out of focus past her, and that helps create a sense of depth and gives you the impression that she's sort of walking into this scene and walking out into the distance, which can help with telling a little bit more of a story rather than just having someone stand in the grass and we take a snapshot of her. And you can see most of these images Jade isn't even looking at the camera. She's not really doing much in the way of posing, she's just walking off into the distance. A little bit of a scarf flick does help to create a little bit of movement, but essentially you could do this with anyone you have with you. Get them in a nice coat and a scarf and walk them through any kind of beautiful or interesting landscape, and you can create some absolutely stunning images. Normally, if I intend to go out and shoot portraits like this, I will carry a reflector with me, just in case. A reflector is super lightweight and easy to carry, get out of jail free card for difficult lighting situations. One thing I particularly love about these cameras is the colour science. Canon have always had an amazing reputation for colour science, but with these particular cameras, the new ones, the new sensors, there's something about them that I just absolutely love. I don't know what it is, there's just so much tonal range and the colours are absolutely beautiful. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of what these files are like to actually play with and how much information is in them, I've got one open up in Photoshop in Adobe Camera Raw, and you can see some of this texture looks quite blown. There's not a lot of detail in the sky, and if I want to pull that back, quite often it's quite difficult to get a lot of the information and get that information from this foreground, which would have been quite shadowy area, and that background sky, which was quite bright. With these cameras, there's so much dynamic range that we have a lot of scope to play with this. So I'm going to bring down the highlights straight away, and you can immediately see that there is more detail and texture in the sky. There are some individual clouds that we can see, and it's not completely blown out, so there is more information there. So what I can do is I can just bring down the exposure, and you can see that sky starting to really come out. And then I can bring up the shadows. I don't want to go too far, I don't want it to look too HDR-y, but that gives you a nice basis to play with. And I can reduce the blacks just to increase the contrast. So immediately we've got a lot more of a punchy, more balanced image, even though I didn't take any extra lighting, I didn't take a reflector or anything like that. I can work in tricky lighting situations and still get all the information across the image. It's absolutely brilliant way to work. Having this flexibility does make it so much easier to shoot in tricky lighting situations, whereas sometimes I might need to use a reflector or some lighting to illuminate the foreground of a scene because the background's quite bright and the foreground's quite dark. Now I don't necessarily have to. I can just shoot somewhere in the middle of the exposure and make sure that nothing is clipped at the bottom or top, and then I can bring it all back. And there's absolutely no degradation in this. I've not lost any information, it's not sort of fallen apart because I've pulled it back too much. It's just holding up really, really well. And it's so fun to edit images like this because you can play around as much as you like and it doesn't fall apart. As you push your ISO up, you also do lose dynamic range. So as you go up into high ISOs, the amount of information across from highlights to shadows that you can capture does reduce. And for different cameras, that curve can be quite steep. So as soon as you start pushing up your ISO, your dynamic range starts to plummet quite quickly. One thing Canon have done very well on these cameras is to control that curve, so that as when you push up your ISO, the dynamic range doesn't just plummet, it slowly gradually comes down. So as you go up, you're still getting more dynamic range than you would on some other cameras, which means in a very practical, real-world sense, particularly if you're shooting high-pressure environments and quickly changing lighting situations, you get far more flexibility with these sensors than ever before. It's absolutely brilliant. So there are some features I haven't yet spoken about on this camera. The R6 has dual card slots, and on this one they're both SD cards. On the R5 one's a CF Express card, but on this one it's both SDs. And you can take advantage of high-speed UHS-2 compatible cards. I've been fortunate enough to have an R6 and an R5 since launch, but the R6 that I've had hasn't been a production model, so I can't really show you any of the images that I've been shooting and playing with up until the very recent ones that I've done for this video. But it has given me an opportunity to play around and test out how capable this camera is in a variety of different conditions, and I can't really understate how much of a good deal this camera is when you consider that you're effectively getting the 1DX Mark III. And I have said that already, but it's worth reiterating because you're getting a very similar low light performance that you'd get from the 1DX Mark III, as well as a much lower low light focusing capability than you will get from the 1DX Mark III. So on this camera you can focus down to -6.5 EV. To give you an idea of what that means, -6 EV takes the human eye a minute to adjust to. So if the lights went out, it would take you a full minute to be able to, navigate a room. The R6 can continue to focus even in those sort of conditions. It's just spectacular. For a wedding photographer or an event photographer or a press photographer in a tricky situation, to be able to focus reliably in those sort of conditions is just, it's kind of mind-blowing. And that's technology that just simply wasn't even there 3 years ago, less than that, 2 years ago. You couldn't get even close to that low level of focusing. One thing I haven't mentioned yet in this video is the performance of EF lenses on the R system when you're using the adapter. So the EF lenses are those lenses that are designed for the digital SLRs. If you already have a Canon camera, you undoubtedly already have some EF lenses, or EFS lenses even. And with the adapter you can use those lenses on the RF mount system. There is no disadvantage to doing this. You don't lose any light, you don't lose any focusing ability. In fact, the performance you get out of your current lenses actually improves when you bring them over to the R system. They focus faster, they focus more accurately. And that is down to how dual pixel AF works differently to how a through the viewfinder focusing system works on a digital SLR. Quite a few digital SLRs do use dual pixel AF, but only when you go into live view. So if you're using the viewfinder on a 5D Mark IV, for example, you have a series of mirrors and the focusing system's at the bottom. On the R system, the focusing system is on the sensor. Every pixel is a focusing point, effectively. Because what dual pixel does is it splits every individual pixel into 2 photo sites. So you have 2 photo sites and 1 micro lens over every pixel. And by having that, you're able to have effectively a left and right eye, and then you can measure distances and you can focus using that distance information. And by being able to do that on every point, you're not replacing individual pixels with phase detection points, and you're not using a contrast-based system. Because the issue with contrast-based systems is when it gets to low light, you can really struggle to get any contrast. Everything sort of starts to look the same. With this dual pixel system, you get the accuracy of contrast-based and the speed of phase detection, and it works in incredibly low light. On the R5, you're looking at -6 EV, and on the R6, you're looking at -6.5 EV. To give you a reference, 3 EV is moonlight, -4 EV is starlight, -6 EV takes the human eye about a minute to adjust to. That's how low light we're talking. So for wedding photographers and event photographers, people that are going to be photographing tricky situations where the light is changing a lot or you just don't have a lot, you can continue like it's daylight. It's just fantastic. Another thing I love about this camera, and I was particularly keen on using this camera for wedding photography for this reason, is the low light performance is one thing, but also being able to shoot completely silently. If you're in a church, for example, you don't want to be having that shutter going off quite noisily and disturbing the ceremony. With this, you can shoot completely silently at 20 frames a second. So for sports photography, wildlife photography, this is great. Particularly wildlife photography, you're not disturbing any of the wildlife. But you're still getting full autofocus tracking and shooting at 20 frames per second, which is just bonkers. And if you need the mechanical shutter, it's not exactly slow. It's 12 frames a second, full mechanical shutter. If you're an existing Canon user and you're using a digital SLR, this camera has a few of the similarities. It still uses an LPE6 battery, so if you're using any of the sort of 5D series camera for the last sort of 10 years, 7D, 80D, that type of camera, it uses the same battery format. It is a higher capacity version now though, so it's an LPE6NH, which gives you a little bit more power. It's backwards compatible. You can use it in your current charger. You can use your current batteries in this camera. There's no disadvantage to doing so. It all sort of works either way. It just means that going forward, Canon are releasing these higher capacity versions of the same battery. There's a whole host of other new little details in this camera. Too long to list in this video. It would make it really rather long. For me, the key things are sort of how it behaves for me as a tool, and the ergonomics of this camera are so much more intuitive and easier to use, and they feel very similar to a digital SLR, like my 5D Mark IV, but with all of the advantages of the mirrorless systems. And I won't go back now, so I will never go back to a digital SLR if I can help it. The mirrorless system is fundamentally better. And if you're using current EF glass, that all works perfectly well as well. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will leave you with about a 10-minute slideshow of images from this video and perhaps some others, and so that you have time to ask me any questions you want in the live chat below. If you're watching this as it goes out for the first time on the YouTube premiere. If not, you can always send me a message on Instagram. I'm at rajk.photo. If you want to find me, follow me and send me a message, that'd be great. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe. Goodbye.